Most people seek what's known as allopathic solutions. Allopathic means treat the symptom, not the cause.
Everyone has some unresolved emotional crap. And as long as we are committed to just treating medication, or as helpful as it is for some people, just talking about it in talk therapy at a rational level, then we're not really solving the cause. The cause is what the person is thinking every day that predisposes them to emotionally and behaviorally reacting. That's where a lot of hypnosis comes in, is changing the belief. Once the real issue is resolved at the root, at a subconscious level, it doesn't come back. So basically we took the vicious cycle and just, cut it.
You're giving your client agencies back to them.
Everyone, no matter where they are in life, has the potential to unlearn these disempowering mental programs.
Well, hello everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with another Infinite Loops. Today we have back by popular request my guest Todd Goodwin, who is a board-certified hypnosis expert, also a master practitioner of neuro-linguistic programming, something that we talked about earlier and that I studied endlessly when I was a teenager, when all that stuff was kind of cool. We got so many.
Sorry. You mean it's not cool anymore? I'm bringing it back, baby. It's cool once again. Sorry.
We are single-handedly, you and me, going to make neuro-linguistic programming cool again. Let's make that our goal. What do you think?
And with a name like neuro-linguistic programming, what's not to love? It's already cool.
Yeah, but all the tech guys are going to say NLP means natural language programming.
Right.
We move on.
Who needs AI? Who needs artificial intelligence if you can really master your natural intelligence? And most people have not yet begun to master that, but that's an important thing. The natural intelligence can solve many problems without AI.
See, I completely agree with you, but I also am very excited about AI because AI can be an amplifier of our natural intelligence, which I think is very cool. AI has the ability, like we can't, at least I can't, look into an array of, 100 million data items and see all of the liminal connections. And I think one of the really cool uses of AI is it can. And so we're going to do lots of projects like feeding every story back to Gilgamesh into AI. Let's actually jump in. We were chatting beforehand, and you said a couple of things that really fascinated me. Today, we're going to look at all of the various case studies that illuminate why hypnosis can be so helpful for people. And as I was getting ready for today's podcast, one of the things that caught my eye in your stuff was most people seek what's known as allopathic solutions. Allopathic, which is basically the way the United States practices medicine, by and large. Allopathic means treat the symptom, not the cause. So we get, what's downstream from that are a lot of behaviors that are not great, right? Like if you've got a horrible headache and all you do is pound Aleve or aspirin or whatever, that can solve it in the short term, but oftentimes it's not looking for the cause of those headaches. Sometimes benign, sometimes serious. So it also kind of conditions us, I think, and I want your opinion, obviously, to think, I got a headache, I'm just going to take some aspirin and move on. And most of the time, yeah, that's fine. But sometimes when we don't look for the cause, we can just have that recur. And when we were chatting, you said that you look at symptoms as states. I like that because, a lot of these things, and I'm going to ask you to walk us through some to help people understand. Uh, the states can be like somebody's overweight. That's a state. It's a symptom, but it might have a cause that is very, very different. And what I'd like you to do, Todd, is take a couple of examples of people you've treated successfully in the past with hypnosis, because my guess is they tried a lot of other stuff first. Please.
Yeah, for sure, and I'd be happy to. Can I just start with a brief parable that I think will really cement the whole notion of what you were talking about when you said upstream or downstream. It triggered this. So there's something called the parable of the river, and you may know it, but this is my retelling of it as I recall. So there was this in a far off land. There was a river and a village on the side of the river, and there were some people, just picnicking or something on the side of the river, and they noticed that a baby was just sort of floating down the river towards a waterfall. And these people were very alarmed, and they went back to the village. And, after a few more sightings of more babies, one at a time floating down the river to their doom, they gathered the elders of the village together, and they said, what are we going to do? We have to save these babies. We have to, prevent them from going over the waterfall. And so they all agreed that they would set up watchtowers to see the babies coming from a little farther upstream, so they'd have time to go and, go in and rescue them with rafts and swimmers and divers and all these things. And they set up all this whole apparatus to prevent the babies from falling over the waterfall. And so it became like the main focus of the village. And while at first this was successful, over time, more and more babies were floating down the river. And it became almost too many for the people of the village to handle. More watchtowers, more divers, more swimmers. Pretty soon there were dozens of babies at any given time going down the river. And someone said, wait a second, why don't we go upstream and figure out how these babies are ending up in the river to begin with? And the village elders said, no, don't be foolish. If we do that, we won't have anyone here downstream to stop them from going over the waterfall. So when I've told that story before to illustrate, in a way, the absurdity of our sick care system, and I mean that in mental health as well as the physical allopathic approach, is that while, yes, it's important that we treat symptoms, because symptoms lead to harmful, unhealthy, chronic states like obesity or poor health, financial relationship issues. That's not really a allopathic issue, but there's any number of persistent states that people have that they suffer from, and that is really the main reason why our healthcare system is a disaster and so expensive. And so while it's important to treat symptoms, it's critically important to go upstream and figure out who's dropping these babies in the river to begin with, and go upstream to the cause. And now I used to be a nutritionist 20-something years ago, and so I learned all about this from the dietary point of view. But even people who are overweight because they're eating too much or eating poorly and not moving enough, and usually that's the cause, that is usually caused by something emotional. And that emotion is usually caused by something the person is thinking. And that thought pattern, whether it's mental pictures or a belief, is often is often programmed into their subconscious mind by some emotionally distressing experience. And I do want to say, before I get into a few examples, and jump in anytime you want, Jim, but the adverse childhood experiences, the ACE studies they've done where they look at what's included in that is everything from neglect to physical, sexual, verbal abuse, to being at home, growing up with domestic violence, substance abuse, even divorce in some cases, and other very or mental illness with a parent. So these things, based on various studies, have affected probably, I read 55 to 65% of people, depending on the study, have had some adverse childhood experience, and some portion of those have had 3 or 4 or 5 of them. Then when you add into that adult onset, or I should say adult life traumatic experiences, we're looking at the vast majority of people who have had emotionally upsetting experiences, and most people, by no fault of their own, do not process that experience fully and effectively. And as a result, it leaves residual baggage, which over time causes emotional and behavioral problems. And when those emotional and behavioral problems are persistent, you have hormonal imbalances, stress hormones, sex hormones, all these things can be imbalanced due to certain emotional and behavioral tendencies, plus weight gain, plus weakened immune system, and so on. And then that leads to chronic and degenerative illnesses, not to mention any number of other social problems. And as long as we are committed to just treating medication, or as helpful as it is for some people, just talking about it in talk therapy at a rational level, then we're not really solving the cause. And the cause is not, solved by preventing kids from being in upsetting environments growing up, because that's inevitable. That's part of life. The cause is what the person is thinking every day that predisposes them to emotionally and behaviorally reacting. So everyone, no matter where they are in life, has the potential to unlearn these disempowering, very often disabling and debilitating mental programs. And once that happens, then you're basically pulling the weed out by the roots, and everything that comes from that root, which is the thought process, and everything that comes from it emotionally and behaviorally goes away. And then you have a real shot at resolving that state, whether it's financial dependency or codependency, relationship sabotage, obesity, addiction, chronic grief or depression, and so on.
My current guest on the podcast that's up right now as we're recording this is a consultant on decision making, and he had a really interesting comment that what you've just said reminds me of. And his comment was that habits are what create your personality. And I thought that was like really interesting, because it's tangential, but it's adjacent, certainly, that kind of this idea of what you consistently and persistently think becomes your reality, right? Not always, of course. Like if we were delusional and we thought we were on, aliens from Sirius, maybe that doesn't become a reality, but it maybe gets us institutionalized. But as I listen, that seems to make sense to me, and it almost seems. I was approached not too long ago by a friend who we used to be on the speaking circuit together, and he was like, "Dude, I can't make speeches anymore." And I'm like, "What do you mean? You're not doing it? You're retired from," because like that was like a main source of his income.
Yeah.
And he's like, no. I literally am terrified. I have the world's worst stage fright. And I was really, really shocked, because like for, I don't know, however many years, he's younger than I am, but so say for 10 years, anytime I was speaking with him, I was always taken by like how good he was. He was a natural, you know what I mean? And it sounded, I don't know why this got jarred in my memory, but listening to you, it sounds like he might have had some sort of like one of these seeds that then got watered.
Yeah, and that's interesting because, I've worked a lot with people with fear of public speaking, which I have maybe infamously said is not at all about speaking in public. So it's usually generally a fear of judgment or criticism or rejection, which ultimately comes from a fear of not being good enough, smart enough, ready enough, whatever. So the seed could have been here's what's really interesting. The seed could have been something a parent said. I'm not saying in your friend's case, but I've had clients where their parent warned them a lot, don't talk to strangers.
Yeah, that's really funny.
No, I mean,
because
it's really,
but that's who you're talking to when you're giving big
absolutely.
speeches.
That's because you ask these people, do you feel nervous when you talk to people you know very well? No. Do you feel nervous when you talk to people you don't know? Yes. Now, it's not always that way, but sometimes my point of mentioning this is that this is not always the case, but sometimes something really seemingly harmless, don't talk to strangers, good advice for a child, not good advice for an adult in business, clearly, or the world is a dangerous place, bad things could happen, these kind of things. Now, that's useful as a child. It's very protective. But that seed, that idea gets planted and may or may not germinate later on as a weed that's actually actively growing in the garden of the person's mind. There's a poem or a little thing called, it's a very short poem, my mind is a garden, my thoughts are the seeds, my harvest will be either flowers or weeds. Mel Weldon, don't know who he is, but he was the one who wrote that. And I use that a lot as an analogy because our mind is a garden, and what we allow to be planted, sometimes it's not our doing. It was planted before we had conscious awareness, hence children who were traumatized by something. But it's our responsibility, if we don't play victim and we have self-awareness and the desire to improve our life and take responsibility, it's our responsibility, Jim, to go in there and do some weeding. And, weeding can be done by, you can sit there when you have weeds in your garden and you can analyze and you can, label the species and the typical direction it might have come in through on the wind and its effect on other plants in the garden and what causes it to grow quickly and what will happen as a consequence if you don't get the weeds out of there. Now, this is sometimes like talk therapy. It's very interesting, but you're still left with a weed no matter how much you analyze it. And some people say, well, just spray herbicide, spray weed killer on it. And that does usually work. But it also can poison other flowers. It can poison the soil. It can create a toxic environment for anything else you want to do. And for some people, that's like psychiatric meds, which can have side effects and be addictive. Now, let me first say that those two approaches are appropriate in certain situations. But in my experience, and as a hypnotist, that goes back to 2007, they're overused and they're not dealing with the real issue, which is the subconscious thought pattern. The thought pattern becomes habitual, creating emotional and habitual emotions, habitual behaviors, creating a certain state. But you're right about the personality. I've heard that as well. So what you do, what you think, feel, and do consistently, in a way, comes to define you. Because we are basically the sum of all of our patterns, behavioral patterns, emotional patterns, thought patterns, most of which are actually unconscious or subconscious. We may be aware of them after the fact, but not why we're doing what we're doing, and often not how we're doing it. So if someone becomes anxious or has a phobic response, they become terrified in a certain environment or feel this overwhelming urge to engage in some unhealthy behavior or substance, they're usually not aware of how they're doing it. They're just aware that they're doing it. And if they don't understand how, which is really more important than why, then it's really hard for them to stop because willpower doesn't control the subconscious mind. And willpower is a short-term remedy, if you want to call it that. So the point is that, you can use weed killer, you can analyze and catalog the weeds. You can use, positive thinking, which is a farce, and it harms a lot of people, excessive one-sided thinking. And you can convince yourself, you say, oh, the weeds are gone, the weeds are gone. And then you look and, oh, shit, they're still there, because that doesn't work. You can use behavior modification, which was my chief tool as a nutritionist, very briefly, with overweight clients. And that's just control yourself. Don't eat this, eat that. Well, that's great in theory if we were all unemotional, but that's like trimming the weeds or stomping up and down on them. And all of this goes to say that as long as the damn roots are there, usually it's going to come back. And so we don't need to go on this journey of figuring out where this came from or why you have all these issues or what's going to happen if you don't change. I mean, that may be interesting, a little self-indulgent perhaps, but it's not going to solve anything. One of my mentors once said, revelation is not resolution. So just speculating about the origin of something, which may be incorrect, but even if it's correct, that doesn't by itself usually solve the symptom. And so the only way is to look at the weed, and all you have to see is the weed growing to know that there are some roots there. So as a hypnotist, I'm going long on these metaphors, but your listeners are going to remember this because these are very relatable metaphors, and it's very accurate, I believe, in how the mind works. As long as we know there are roots, doesn't necessarily matter how they got there, we just got to pull them out. Once the roots are removed, once the weed has been uprooted, the entire weed, all the symptoms, everything that's apparent on the conscious level, go away. It all goes away, and that weed does not return. Now, there may be another seed that blows into the garden and another weed will take root. But once the real issue is resolved at the root, mentally, at a subconscious level, okay, it doesn't come back. It's that simple. So you can jump in, but as I was saying this, I was thinking of a few clients that illustrate some of this that I've had in the past. I think might be kind of interesting, and one's kind of entertaining.
Let's jump right into them, and let's start with the entertaining one.
Okay, so maybe around 10 years ago, more or less, I had a client who was a flasher, and it's okay to laugh. It had a good ending. But I don't mean the flashing episode. I mean the relationship.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't see any close video. I didn't. This was before people were videotaping everything on smartphones. So basically, this guy, and a lot of my clients were, are business owners, CEOs, executives, and a lot of people, listening to this may not realize, like, they walk among us. Everyone has some unresolved emotional crap. It's no one's fault. It just happened. That's a casualty of living. Childhood is that period during which we get screwed up so that when we're adults, we can, if we choose to, get unscrewed up. So this guy, I don't even know if there was a traumatic experience. I wasn't focused as much on trauma at the time like I am now. But his symptom was that he would, he had a very good job. He was an executive, and he would go out on his lunch break about 3 times a week during work, and he would drive around looking for an age-appropriate woman, so no minors or old ladies, according to what he said. And he would, I didn't ask him if he wore a trench coat or, that kind of stuff. I don't know the details, but he would basically get out of his car. He would, exhibit himself, and there would be some kind of response from the woman. And then he would go off and masturbate somewhere, and that would be his pattern. Then he would feel guilty, ashamed, and irritable for like a day or so. And then he would start like picturing it again. he would start feeling this urge. And the only way to alleviate that uncomfortable craving or urge was to go out and do it. He called this having fun. That was his euphemism for it. Now, his wife didn't think it was that much fun because he had a 2-year-old at the time. His marriage was on the rocks. His wife was this close to divorcing him because she actually only knew he did it once a week. So she had known it was almost every day. But he had been arrested twice. He was this close to losing his kid, his marriage, his career. And he came to see me and he said, I have this sexual compulsion and I've been to a therapist. I've been also given meds. I've been diagnosed as antisocial personality disorder and whatever other stuff. And he said, I've been told I'm mentally ill and I don't know where else to go. I sometimes wish I were the first recourse and not the last for a lot of people because it would save them a lot of time, money, and hassle. Anyway, long story short, I said to him, he explained to me how the whole cycle worked, and I already explained it. And I said, if you didn't think about it, you wouldn't feel like doing it. Is that right? And he said, yeah, because it starts with, picturing it, remembering a time and he did it. And if you didn't feel like doing it, you wouldn't do it, right? And he said, yeah, because I feel guilty. I don't want to do it, but I can't help myself, like the angel and the devil battling on the shoulder. And so I said, well, this is really very simple. I said, you're not mentally ill. I don't diagnose people, but in my, just as I look at it, you just have a thinking problem. And he looked relieved. And I said, well, we just need to change how you think about it. And when that happens, it will change how you feel and change what you do. So to me, it looked very simple. And I kid you not, after 2 sessions, he stopped doing it. Actually, after the first, he walked around the outside of his house naked. He reported back to me, and I said, "Well, that's better." I'm not sure if you could get arrested.
He must have had a really big piece of property. No neighbors to see him, or.
Well, actually, that's what one of the women that he flashed said. Sorry.
Boy,
anyway, so sorry. You pay for the subconscious skills, you get the bad jokes for free. So anyway, and then after 3 or 4, he stopped even thinking about it. And then there was no urge, no thought, but right away he stopped doing it. And then at the end, I think I saw him 5 times. At the end of his last session, he was going on a cruise with his wife and things were improving in that area. So, but the reason I mention that is because it wasn't important to know why he did it. We could have spent months. A friend of mine who was a psychotherapist, when I told her about this, she said, you didn't ask about his childhood, his relationship with his mom and all these sort of things. I said, no. I could have, but I said, that doesn't really matter because what he was doing, the recipe that he put together in his mind unconsciously is the reason he did it. And once we did some work using NLP primarily to change how his mind played with that imagery, it eliminated the desire and then the uncomfortable craving because he lacked what he wanted, right? It just stopped right there. So basically we took the vicious cycle and just, cut it. And then the epilogue is he came back to me maybe a year later, to quit smoking, which I honestly wish was the first thing he did because he stunk. The guy smoked like 2 packs a day, but he wasn't ready. He wanted to deal with the flashing first, which I agree was more urgent. But then he quit smoking. I said, well, how are you doing with that whole thing we dealt with a couple of years ago? He said, oh, I never did it again. So I said, well, this will be easy. And we worked on smoking.
So it reminds me of Wittgenstein's maxim, don't look for meaning, look for use. And so it seems to me, I don't quite understand why, to me, that solution, that's a real solution, right? Instead of, spending hours or days, weeks, months, who knows, trying to figure out why he was doing that. I love the pragmatic approach of, well, who gives a shit why he was doing it? That is obviously a behavior that's going to cost him dearly. if you can figure out a way to end that behavior, it seems to me that seems to be very, very sensible. Which leads me to the question, like, what is it? Because you have documented uh, use cases and proof cases like the one you just mentioned,
Right.
where you're able to quickly, swiftly end a behavior that is potentially ruining somebody's entire life. Why do we take the other path first?
Well, it's actually similar to what I believe you asked me in the previous episode where we were talking a couple months ago about, why, and I think I said this is the best kept secret that's not really a secret. And you said, why isn't this more widespread, or why doesn't everyone do this? And I've heard that a lot from clients. And there's a number of reasons. So in order to not repeat myself, I would encourage whoever's listening, go back and listen to the first one, because we cover a lot of foundational concepts there. I think it's part of it is just an entrenched, outdated paradigm. Why is it that when people are ill, that changing nutrition is not the very first thing they do before taking medications or whatever it might be? Why isn't every person who's diagnosed with cancer given a nutritionist? Now, I can say as a former one that alone is not necessarily going to help that much, but at least it's trying. If a person has cancer, there's a number of potential causes, one of which could be malnutrition or certain toxic substances that they're eating. That's one possibility. Others, emotional issues not dealt with. Others, environmental toxins. There could be some genetic issues, but usually your lifestyle will promote or inhibit a genetic tendency. Just like obesity, no one is naturally fat. They might have an obesity gene, but they have to actually act as an overweight person acts to become obese. So why do people take medication? Because it's easier than trying to figure out what the real issue is. Why do they go to talk therapy, which again is useful for some people and maybe for many people in a very limited dose, but it's not transformative for a lot of people because it's a conscious level intervention. And the problem, any persistent problem, is a subconscious pattern. What we learn, whether it's, you and I have spoken about learning to drive or, learning to do any complex behavior, is a subconscious program. And that's whether it's useful or not useful. Our subconscious doesn't necessarily judge something as this is going to be helpful in my long-term arc of my life. It's just we do it again and again and again. And so as we don't waste mental resources or brain resources trying to consciously control everything, the subconscious takes over, says, let me handle that for you. And then it just becomes automatic. And by the way, it's not just physical behaviors like driving, juggling, walking. It's emotional habits. So we might say, well, I put one foot on, my pants on one, left leg first, then right leg. And most people do it the same way every single time. And that's just an unconscious habit. But when people become anxious, or they have a tendency to have a panic attack, or they react to something that, with a strong emotional reaction like a phobia, that is usually a habit. And that means it's an emotional habit that's usually caused by a thought. And so it's, again, get back to what's causing it. This is endlessly frustrating to me, Jim. Why don't more people do it? That's the best answer I can give you. And by the way, so it's a paradigm. Think about how many medical doctors there are, how many psychotherapists there are, compared to how many naturopaths, nutritionists, or hypnotists. And not only that, there's a bias of training because the medical establishment has certain um, influences what's in the textbooks that medical doctors or that med students learn, and even people in pre-med programs learn certain things. So they're raised with a bias of training that favors a very narrow approach as opposed to a more holistic or, funnel vision approach where you can see all possibilities. Allopathic medicine is very useful in some contexts. Talk therapy is as well. Medication is as well. But so is nutrition, so is dealing with the subconscious, and I don't exclude those conventional approaches. I just feel like that should be part of the solution and not the sole solution.
It reminds me of Semmelweis. I'm sure you know his story.
Oh yeah, that's
and for those who don't know the Semmelweis story, very briefly, he was a doctor with Vienna, right? I think in Vienna.
Sounds like, I believe so.
And so who was put in charge of a maternity ward there, and this was during the early 19th century, I believe. And at the time, it wasn't fashionable for men to wash their hands. And he came in and noticed that the women who were being attended by surgeons or male doctors were dying at a rate which was alarmingly higher than those who were being helped by midwives, women. And so he thought of, a lot of the reasons for why that could be. And the first thing that sprang to mind, now remember, this is before germ theory, so it was seen as kind of an unusual insight. But he thought, well, maybe it's because they're going from dissecting cadavers to learn about the human body, not cleaning their hands and attending the mothers to be. And so he made a rule that all male surgeons had to wash their hands in a solution of, I think, lye and some other things that would, super clean, right? And all of the doctors were absolutely just insulted by this. He wants us to not be manly. He wants us to be like women. This is outrageous. And they came up with all these alternate explanations, right? Like, no, it's not this. It's because the priest is ringing the death bell after a woman dies, and that makes other people, the other women, they're mimetic and they die too. So someone was like, cool. He told the priest, don't ring the bell anymore. Then the priest didn't. The women kept dying, and he goes, let's try my solution. And as you know, after being forced to wash their hands, the death rate of the women being attended by them plummeted. But the so what of this story that really underlines why this is so scary and dangerous is Semmelweis was also political, and he was arrested at a demonstration in favor of democracy, removed as the head of the maternal unit, replaced by a guy who was very conventional. He saw the data. This is what kills me.
Yeah.
He saw all of the empirical evidence, made them wash their hands, death rates plummet, and he just went, this is nonsense. Stopped the male surgeons from washing their hands. Women's death rates went back up, where they stayed for like 70 years until somebody revisited the research and we had the germ theory. And so it's this cultural lag. And it kind of makes me think, like, if you could amplify, I don't know, a show, a TV show, a Netflix, whatever, where you kind of show, each episode is you helping somebody with a seemingly intractable problem. Do you think the socialization, putting it into the Overton window, would increase people using this technique and the way of solving these problems?
Well, for sure. In fact, it's interesting that I years ago when I lived and worked in Miami, I did work briefly with a TV producer who was interested in doing a reality show on the kind of work I did. And I was very upfront with him. And I said, look, I'll be honest, what I do is pretty boring to a camera. I mean, even if they weren't trying to create drama, as they often do in reality unscripted shows, I said most of the magic, if you want to call it that, the magical aspect of this work happens in a person's mind. Camera's not going to pick that up. And so the sessions that I do with people, with some exceptions, there are some exceptions where it's like within minutes, sometimes seconds, there's a shift from, tears and anxiety to, laughter and relief. But generally, most of the work that I do is boring to look at from an outside perspective. And so I said, this is not going to play well on TV.
Let me put my producer hat on and say, you're familiar with the show The Dog Whisperer?
Get it?
Okay. So I love that show. I love dogs. And I also sort of took his attitude about how to interact with a dog. Whereas my family, my wife specifically, and my kids, like, oh, well, that's just the way he is. I'm like, no. You've got to establish that you are the alpha male of the pack or female, and don't understand the way a dog processes this. But if you just visually set it up, if I was producing this show, I would first show the participant engaging in this behavior, show the ill effects of that, kind of like they do on that show, cut to you working with them, showing how you do it, and then showing them after. And not engaging in that. And, I can just see the visuals already. Like, we have an agoraphobic person, right? And they can't leave the house, and like, that's scary. Did you ever see the movie The Aviator with DiCaprio playing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hughes.
Hughes. And there's a great scene in that I often think about, where he had this obsessive compulsive disorder. And the scene is he's in a men's room and he can't touch the handle to leave. And so he's just shows him like trying to move his hand. He's trying to will his hand to grab the handle. Doesn't work for the reasons which you've already articulated. And the scene is so compelling to me because DiCaprio does a really good job of showing like the angst, just the palpable fear that Hughes was feeling. And then the rush of relief when somebody comes in and he dashes through the door.
Yeah. But that highlights the power of the irrational subconscious mind, whose prime directive is self-preservation. So if he had a belief, which is often the case with OCD, that there's, they obsess about it's fear-based, often trauma originated in trauma, but there is the belief that they're not safe in a given context. And that their belief is that if I don't engage in this behavior, hence the compulsion, then something bad's going to happen. And so trying to control it from the top down, which is the behavior, is really hard, because by the time it manifests as a behavior, like an action or inaction, it is a physical behavior, the emotion is already full on and it's really hard to control. But if you can change the thinking and the beliefs that lead to the fear and the obsessing about the object of the fear or the environment, then the emotional part goes away. The mind becomes more clear, so it's not obsessing, and then there's no compulsion. Kind of like the flasher, except I don't diagnose people, so I don't know if he would be. I don't think that would be considered an obsessive compulsive disorder, but it was definitely a compulsion or addiction. But he was obsessing about it, and he had a compulsion. So, labels are great. I just don't label people. I also think that a lot of the time diagnoses, while useful for categorizing things, like, what species is this weed growing in my garden, it is very disempowering for a lot of people, because there's a lot of baggage that goes with diagnoses. And a person can identify with, I'm an addict. I am, I have major depressive disorder. I'm an anxious person. I'm a smoker, whatever. And then when their identity gets tied up in the unhealthy behavior, it makes it much harder for them to change their behavior because the identity is going to dictate the behavior. And like what you talked about the person and your personality, another way to look at that might be your identity because it feeds on itself, right? The personality is ultimately the sum total of all the different thoughts, feelings, and actions, because that dictates how you show up in life. So if there is an identity, however it got there, maybe childhood, then you are this kind of person. Or if the person is very suggestible and an authority like a therapist with very good intentions might diagnose this person as having a disorder, and the person latches onto it. So if a person believes they're an addict and they're powerless over their addiction, let's say, one of the steps of the 12th step is to admit that. The problem is, if you believe you're an addict or an alcoholic or whatever, and I mentioned this in my book I wrote about quitting smoking, using it as a smoker, then you may temporarily quit the behavior, but as long as your belief that you are equivalent to that behavior is intact, it's only a matter of time before some catalyst is going to cause the person to relapse and go back into it. So why not change the self-image, the self-assessment, change the identity from I am an addict to I am a person who on some level chooses to engage in this behavior, but I am choosing it, which means I can choose differently, not through willpower, but through changing the underlying mental programming that's causing the emotion and the behavior. Because most addictions are emotionally compulsive behaviors, which means there's an emotional urge or desire to have something. When they don't have it, they feel crappy. And then the crappy feeling goes away when they engage in that behavior. But it's a temporary solution, which is why it repeats again and again. And then that becomes habitual. And there we are. So can I mention a few, I want to mention a few examples of this as it relates to trauma, because as you know, in recent years, I've focused a lot more on the traumatic origin of emotional and behavioral challenges. And by focusing on clearing the emotional charge from traumatic memories, that's usually the shortcut to pulling the weeds out by the roots.
Please do.
Okay, so like I said, I don't diagnose people with PTSD. They usually have already been to a therapist or a psychiatrist who has diagnosed them, or they've gone online. As you know, we all know you can diagnose yourself, which is not necessarily a good thing. But people come to me typically having already tried some form of talk therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, maybe EMDR, or antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, and so on. A couple clients, one who was diagnosed with PTSD. This is a pretty impactful, traumatic story with a good ending. She came to me and she said, my main problem is that I can't sleep without taking, I think it was Ambien or one of those pills. And she had been doing this for about 8 years. And she said, that's my problem. But of course, if you've listened to our first podcast, that's just a symptom. Now, she was mostly just interested in being able to sleep well. And every time she tried to sleep without taking Ambien, she would just feel panicky. And so she was like, she was punished for going off the meds, not because of the medication, but because of her own beliefs and her own mindset. Anyway, it turned out she also abused alcohol, cocaine, and smoked, all as ways of managing her emotional state to deal with her life. Otherwise, she was an executive at a company in Miami and was very, high functioning otherwise, amazingly. And we were talking, and it turned out that when this started, it started when she, in the middle of the night, her husband left the bed. He didn't come back. She went downstairs, saw the light on in the car. The car was in the driveway. She went out to the car and found that he had shot himself in the head in the driver's seat, and he was laying there dead in a bloody car. So that was what she came to at 2 a.m. or something. So needless to say, she was inconsolable and was severely traumatized. And for months, she, was taking meds and doing talk therapy like every day. And it was really upsetting, not to mention the logistics of dealing with, I think she was probably 30 at the time when that happened. So, it was a young marriage and everything. So all of the grief that she was dealing with, the flashbacks, the guilt, maybe she could have prevented it. Maybe she could have seen the signs, whatever. So the flashbacks, she couldn't get the image of his head and the car and the body and all that awful stuff out of her mind. So when these flashbacks would come, which just happened throughout the day, she'd feel awful. She would grab some alcohol. She'd have a cigarette. She clearly couldn't sleep at night without Ambien, which is also an anti-anxiety drug. And so, or very similar to Xanax. So she basically was self-medicating with the help of a psychiatrist, understandably, and that was keeping her level. But the real cause was the flashbacks and thinking about the flashbacker. The flasher was he had actually pleasant flashbacks of when he last flashed. So with her, it was like most people unpleasant, and that's one of the hallmarks of PTSD is hypervigilance and just, being hyper aroused and having these flashbacks. So she couldn't stop thinking about her dead husband and then all of the things surrounding it. Then she felt awful, and then she would behave in a self-medicating way to keep all of that emotional crap at bay. So what we did is we basically cleared the memory. We removed the emotional charge using neurolinguistic programming, like we talked about, NLP, hypnosis, and memory reconsolidation. All of that is described on our website at goodwinhypnosis.com, and we have some videos of clients talking about similar experiences, not objectively like that, but traumatic experiences and how from 1 minute they can go from having a trauma response to very often minutes later feeling no pain from that thought or memory at all. Now, this woman, I didn't erase her mind. She knew what happened. That didn't change. She could still talk about what happened. It just didn't cause any emotional pain anymore. And so as a result, she was able to sleep without the medication. She, with the help of her doctor, got off the Ambien over a course of several months to do it safely, stopped drinking, doing cocaine, stopped smoking. But if we had just tried to get her to quit smoking and doing drugs and alcohol first without clearing the trauma, I guarantee it would not have worked. It doesn't matter how good the hypnotist is, it would not work because the trauma had to be addressed first. That was the seed. Now that's an extreme case, right? There are other cases where, for example, I had a firefighter. I gave a speech once at the Miami-Dade Fire Rescue years ago, and I met a firefighter who had been reassigned to desk work because a few years before, because he was, drinking excessively, and that was affecting clearly his performance. So he said, my problem is, I'm an alcoholic. I drink a lot. I want to get back into the field, but I can't do it because they won't let me because I'm drinking a lot. And I said, well, when did this start? And he said, well, I was diagnosed with PTSD after several years ago, I rescued a guy from a burning house. And he brought him out to the lawn, to the front yard, and the guy died in his arms. So he could not get that image of the guy's, charred face. I hate to be graphic, but, the smell, the sound, the sight, all of that was like literally burned into his memory. And these flashbacks plus the guilt, maybe he could have gotten there faster. Maybe he could have saved him. Usually that's irrational, but, anxiety, regret, all of this stuff, because the thought, Jim, is timeless. It's not, he knew logically this happened years ago, but every time it showed up in his mind every day, it was happening now. And so he's in the presence of this horrific experience, creating anxiety, creating guilt, regret, reliving it, replaying it. He couldn't get it out of his head, but what did work to get it out of his head? Drinking alcohol. And so alcohol was a very effective, albeit imperfect solution, but because it didn't fix anything permanently, he had to keep drinking. So we basically cleared similar kind of approaches or techniques, did some work using his imagination to change how he remembered it without any loss of the narrative. And whereas 1 minute this tough guy was crying just for a minute or so, remembering that experience as he had many times, minutes later, he couldn't even get the image in his head. Same with the woman with the husband who died. No matter how hard they tried, they could not picture it. Now, some people can still picture it, but they almost feel like, okay, so what? It doesn't make them unemotional. They're simply changing the way their mind, their brain stores that information. And when when the memory changes, which is basically the thought, or a part of the thought, then the belief that, I'm not safe, I'm not good enough, bad things happen, whatever the belief that is learned as a result of the experience, whatever that is, that changes more easily. That's where a lot of hypnosis comes in, is changing the belief. And then when they're no longer having this disempowering, toxic belief, they don't feel anxious, depressed, resentful, angry, guilty, ashamed, regretful, whatever. And when they don't have all that emotional crap, then potentially addictive behaviors and substances lose their benefit. Because if you're already feeling okay, well, that's good enough. But if you're feeling like shit, then you want to do something to feel better. And so I often say, if you didn't feel so low, you wouldn't have to get so high. I think I said that first to the flasher. So part of the solution with him, other than the imagination stuff, was to build up his self-worth and give him an alternative way to have fun, euphemistically. And then the behavior went away because he wasn't feeling so low. He didn't have to get so high.
This is all just, as I listen to you, it's just so many of the things link in with things that I've been interested in the past. For example, I study complex adaptive systems because I think that if you understand them, you're going to make better decisions in business and in life, et cetera. One of the key parts of complex adaptive systems is emergence comes from below, not from above, right? And so, as you were saying, the will is kind of this top-down solution, right? And no matter how often you document it empirically, right, people still default to that. And it almost, as I was listening to you, it's kind of like, gee, I wonder if you could like hypnotize somebody to make them understand that this go to, we'll do a top-down solution, right? I mean, so many of the things historically that have nothing to do with trauma or anything. So, for example, the Volstead Act, prohibition in the United States. The facts of the matter were when they passed prohibition in the United States, making alcohol illegal, right? There was a very serious drinking problem in America, right? And it was well and widely known, and it was causing all sorts of heartache, all sorts of problems. Men would go to the bar, get drunk, go home and beat their kids, beat their wife, etc. So they were absolutely correct that there was a very serious drinking problem in America, right? But the top-down solution, okay, we're going to make drinking illegal then, right? Had horrific secondary and tertiary effects, right? Sure. Because it didn't stop people. In fact, more people started drinking that didn't drink in the past. You essentially made the judiciary, the police force, et cetera, corruptible, right? Because money's money, and basically cemented the hold that organized crime had over alcohol and other illicit substances, right? Like, I'm fascinated by it because, like, yes, there was a problem, but the solution caused vastly more intractable problems. That doesn't seem to be the case following your methodology.
Well, but the thing is, thanks to podcasts like yours and people's ability to find hopefully good, useful information online, there's more self-awareness as a result of talking about this sort of thing. Because if people don't know it exists, they're not going to consider it. But brute force is always easier than finesse. And if you can get the cops or the army or whoever you want to enforce something, it's easier just to smack the kid and say, don't do that. Well, but or even the war on terror, okay, so let's just blow shit up because they, did something to us. Instead of, I'm not sympathetic to just make it clear, I'm not a sympathetic person to terrorists, except that in order to defeat terrorism, if it were even possible, you need to understand what's pissing those people off. You can't just say they're evildoers. I know I'm going back to 2001 here, George W. Bush. You can't just say that and expect that's going to solve the problem. The problem, Jim, is that most people have no self-awareness about what's going on in their mind, and which means they lack effective judgment to understand what's going on in other people's minds. And so it's very easy and simplistic, almost moronic, to say, okay, you're either good or evil. I mean, this is the fundamental aspect to certain religions that will go unnamed, where everyone is obsessed with right or wrong, good or evil, black or white. The universe is not black or white. The universe is gray. But human morality, which is totally a construct, is that it's just easier. Just, give me a form and I can say, what my ethnicity is. It used to be the same thing with gender. There were 2 options. Now there's like 50. But the point is, it's easier just to check off one box, because then I can put you in my mind in a certain category, and it's lazy thinking. It's harder to think in nuance, but that's reality. And so it's not hard to clear most traumas. It's really not. But we've been brainwashed, we've been hypnotized by society to believe in the victim-perpetrator duality. And if something happened to someone, they were a victim of someone else's bad deeds. Yeah, I'm generalizing. Then the victim becomes disempowered because they accept as the identity, I am a victim, bad things happen to me. And part of the definition of a victim is the person is subject to being hurt. And so the identity keeps the person disempowered, which means they're not likely to be able to overcome the victim mentality, which often means more shit's going to happen to that person because they're approaching their life on the defensive or running from life instead of engaging in it. So if people don't understand why people do what they do, whether it's blowing up buildings or doing drugs or cheating on their spouse or anything that we have laws against, then they're not going to understand how to change it. And just by throwing police enforcement or having laws is not going to solve it. Otherwise, Nixon's war on drugs 50 years on would have been a resounding success. But there are so many reasons why people do drugs, why they sell drugs, why they, all these sort of things. If you don't deal with the underlying societal and ultimately individual issues, then these societal problems continue. It's easier to simply start at the top down and try to arm wrestle someone into submission than to actually take the time and either in a preventative way, which is hard, prevent those, those ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, to prevent the babies from being thrown into the river to begin with. it's easier to just to do that than, to actually figure out what's going on takes a lot of work. To solve it from where I sit is not that hard, but to get people to consider that they can face their baggage without being afraid of suffering anymore, that takes self-awareness. And, I don't have the marketing budget to educate the whole world on that,
The emergence of learned helplessness is something that obviously alarms me, because societies that are filled with more high agency people versus low agency, empirically just do better. And I back to why, right? I sometimes just try to figure out why are so many people falling into this really destructive behavior pattern of learned helplessness. And, there are a lot of reasons. Certain people, like, they're easier to govern, right? If people are like always thinking they're the victim and it's always somebody else's fault, right? It wasn't my fault. It was that mean person over there. It
Exactly.
absolves them, right, of the responsibility for themselves. I wonder about that. Is this also just another way to give? I want to be careful about using the term responsibility because that's kind of a loaded word. But let's stick with agency, right? It seems to me as I listen to you that another thing you're doing is you're giving your client agencies back to them. Is that right?
Yes. It's helping people get in touch with the innate power that they have, but probably have either abandoned or never realized they had. And, I was joking earlier about natural intelligence versus artificial intelligence. And everything's big about AI right now. And yet we have a natural intelligence to how our brain works. And most people have no clue how it works. Why should they? No one teaches us. And so we all have the ability to change how we think if the situation is approached properly, which can change our life. And so whether you call it giving them agency or helping them regain their power, ultimately the disempowerment that people learn, usually it's learned due to upsetting experiences, that can be relearned, that can be unlearned. I had a client thinking about disempowered. She came to me with a typical pattern of relationship sabotage. She was, in her 30s, and her pattern was she would, had a boyfriend for a period of time, some number of months, and then she would, text him or call him before texting was big, and just, be on this guy like 10 times a day. Now, you can imagine the man, was like, oh, that girl's psycho, whatever, and ended up dumping her. So she had this, this trail of littered dead relationships behind her, largely because she had this fear of abandonment. And, she had been in therapy. She had tried taking anti-anxiety meds because whenever she didn't hear from the guy she was dating, it wasn't like she was thinking he was cheating. She just felt anxious. And the anxiety went away when she reached out and heard from him. So by the way, it's very similar to the flasher. He felt anxious. He felt icky. He felt this urge until he engaged in that, behavior of flashing and masturbating and all of that. So that was his drug experience. In this case, her drug, similar to social media and the dopamine and everything, was finding out, connecting with that man. Long story short, too late. Basically, there was this, this had been an issue in her adult life. But we did a process of accessing the feeling and then leading to the memory that trained her to feel that way. And her memory was when she was 4 years old or so. She got separated from one of her parents at a supermarket or something. And she remembers, crying hysterically. But it was probably only a few minutes, and then, nothing really harmful happened physically, and she was reunited, and that was it. Well, I said, I think you may have learned that if you're dependent on someone, don't take your eyes off them. Because for a child, again, that's very self-protective. But for an adult, that's really a problem. And so she had a belief due to, low self-worth and a few other issues unrelated to that experience, that she needed this man for X, Y, and Z reasons, whoever he was that year. And so because she was dependent emotionally on him and she was attached, his absence created anxiety. And so we changed the memory in some capacity using NLP and memory reconsolidation and these kind of things. And whereas at first she was remembering that memory and felt very, uncomfortable, within minutes, she was fine. And the pattern changed immediately. She no longer had any anxiety because the belief that she would be unsafe without the person she needs changed, because the belief was supported by the evidence of the memory. So when the evidence changed, the memory changed, the belief changed, the emotional response to the belief changed, meaning no more anxiety. When there was no more anxiety, the behavior brought about by the anxiety went away, which was texting, calling, keeping tabs. She felt calm, and she was able to have, relationships without sabotaging them. I mean, it kind of makes you wonder how many cases of relationship sabotage. I don't like the word sabotage because that's a long-term perspective. From the short-term perspective, it's self-preservation. Long-term perspective, it's self-sabotage. She was protecting herself by keeping tabs on the man, even if ultimately she destroyed the relationship that way. But, the pattern was something that it had just become normal for her. And she looked back and said, well, I remember that experience. It wasn't like it was buried. She just said, but I was a kid, nothing bad happened. And it was like a few minutes. I don't know why that would affect me. And I had to explain that children are much more vulnerable to upsetting experiences than adults. To traumatize an adult significantly, usually you need to have a very significant experience. Like clients I've seen who were, raped or found a dead body, or were in a car accident, or had severe injury, or plane crash, any number of, what we would call objectively large traumas, big T. But little t traumas, even a dad yelling at a child, or a mother yelling at a child, or a child watching a dog get hit by a car, that really wouldn't scar an adult, leaves a negative imprint on a child. And one of the reasons, I don't know if we ever talked about this, but from a brainwave state, children are in a hypnotic state. They're in a state of hypnosis almost all the time. That's why they have imaginary friends. They have such a great imagination, and they learn languages and everything so quickly. When adults struggle to do that, it's because they're hypnotized most of the time. That's just part of the development and the evolution of their brain, neuron-wise. So they're hypersuggestible. And so something that might make us just sort of shrug it off, a child can be negatively imprinted by one little thing. Even what we would call a minor, almost throwaway experience. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean,
there's so many other examples I can give you that people can relate to, like, emotional eating, being obese, or substance use issues, or relationship sabotage, or grief and phobias, fear of death, fear, anxieties. These are all symptoms.
Just so many of it's so interesting to me because so many of the things that I'm really, really interested in, you are, as I'm listening to you, are just weaving together in my mind, right? I originally found you because I'm fascinated by Dr. John Sarno and the mind-body issues, having had several and the the idea that a seemingly inconsequential thing, like being separated from your parents briefly as a child, like most people don't know that about kids. I knew what you said about kids because of actually a PhD in consciousness research. Basically, I had read somewhere that we're born with something like 1 billion more neurons that we end up with as adults. And like I was incredulous as I'm reading this, and I just happened to have him on as a guest, and that was my first question to him: "Is this true?" And he went, "Oh yeah." And he explained it. He's like, "Evolution has made it so that you can get dropped anywhere, and it's given you a bunch of redundancies in your brain." And the term he used, which you say hypnotize, he basically said, until about the age of 5, children are tripping balls all the time. But that explains so clearly about how a lot of this stuff is generated from childhood experiences that, again, as adults, we can kind of like look at it and think, oh, come on, really? Because of, a separation at a grocery store. And we kind of instinctively call bullshit on it. But the way you've just described it makes it infinitely easier to understand.
Yeah. And then that's the thing, is part of the problem is people downplay or disregard the potential importance of these childhood experiences. Now, that reminded me, there's a client I had, who she was referred to me by a doctor, and she presented with being overweight. Maybe she was 60 pounds overweight or so, and her patent, I think, she was 50 or 60 at the time, been married for a long time, had a challenging marriage. She was constantly triggered by her husband, stress-wise, and then she would go and eat, wine, cheese, and crackers and all of this. And this would happen almost every day. And so she came to me for help with weight loss. Now, I learned early in my career as a hypnotist, if I didn't get the message as an ex-nutritionist, that being overweight is seldom a random act, a random state. And overeating, in this case, emotional or stress eating, is a symptom of the emotions. Something was triggering her. She thought it was her husband, but that might have just been a reminder of something. We actually did, I think, a session or two on just eating habits, basic hypnosis for that. Often that works. In her case, it didn't work very well. And so then I think it was the third time I saw her. I was going to just see her, I think, 6 or 7 times. And okay, so what I did is I said, okay, well, let's focus on that feeling that you get right before you start stress eating. And the memory that came up for her was one time in particular where, for the first time, she perceived as a child that her dad didn't love her. Her dad favored her 4 brothers or whatever it was. So she had since learned as an adult that her dad did love her. He just had a different way of showing it and all of this sort of stuff, the generational maybe, and he wasn't very affectionate. Even though she knew this logically and had known it for half of her life, her adult life, she still felt this hole, which she could fill with cheese and crackers and wine or whatever the food was. And obviously that led to her being overweight. And so I said, well, we need to just on the fly, because I didn't know this ahead of time. She didn't come to me saying this is the cause of my problem, but it was her perception, even if it was inaccurate. This is the important thing. Our memories are not accurate at all. Usually they're inaccurate, even slightly. And every time we access the memory consciously or unintentionally, it can change slightly. And this is memory reconsolidation, as it naturally happens. It's a form of neuroplasticity. So the brain is remodeling itself around use. And if you access a thought, a memory, you're using that, that neuronal connection, you're using that pathway. And so just like a very delicate flower, every time you touch it, it can be affected by how you touch it. Well, I use that approach, take advantage of that ability in the brain, but do it intentionally and directed to direct the mind or the brain. I use the word mind to change the way it represents that thought. So she remembered that time when she was a child, and it was just one of a few memories. She started crying. I sort of improvised some kind of scenario where I was able to help reframe her relationship with that experience, her dad's motives, his intentions, his behavior, and so on. And basically took her through her life after that moment quickly up to the present day. And she just kept saying, wow, that was big. That was big. She was crying, but it wasn't pain. Initially it was pain, but then it was relief. And I said, what's going on? Because I was leading her through a scenario, but I didn't see what was going on in her head. And she said, I now feel like for the first time in my life that my dad loved me. I feel his love. He was dead. He had been dead for at least 10 years, maybe 20 years. So she couldn't get closure or rely on her dad to say, I love you. She felt it. Now, was that accurate? Was it not? I don't care. I mean, let's be real. It may not have been accurate that he didn't love her. She learned later on he did, but she felt the love was missing. So she grew up with the belief, my dad never loved me. I'm not worthy of love. I'm not as good as my brothers. And her husband, for whatever reason, triggered that. When the memory changed, when the hole in her heart was filled with my dad's love, which, by the way, there's no way in hell you can do this through willpower or analysis. You just can't. I mean, she had been through, therapy. She had tried diets to no avail. Immediately, her stress eating stopped. She even told me her husband started behaving better. I think that was just her perception. She wasn't being triggered, but she didn't have the need, I need in quotes, to drink the wine, to eat the cheese and crackers, to fill the bottomless pit inside of her because it was filled with love. So she may have had an adverse childhood experience that was not one event, but was just the absence of love, affirmation, support, whatever. And it was all her perception. When that changed, Jim, the stress went away, the self-worth improved. I mean, we had to work on each of these things, but right away, she wasn't hitting overwhelm. The allostatic load, the cup of water was not overflowing constantly. We drained the swamp, so to speak. I'm mixing all these metaphors, but basically she was not overwhelmed anymore. Most of that overwhelm was caused by the inside, not by the husband. So it's not because of the external circumstances, but her perception of those events and how it relates to her and her worldview and her relationship with herself and others. When that all changed through a few sessions, but mostly that one session, we had uprooted the weed, the stress eating went away, and then she ended up losing, I think, like 30 pounds over the next 6 months or so. With no willpower, no diets, she just wasn't, quote, sabotaging her weight loss by tending to her emotional needs because emotional needs changed. I mean, there's so many examples of this, but does that make sense? So
it does. So this is endlessly fascinating to me. We have bumped up against our time. I'm thinking like the next time we get together, it might be interesting if you're game, if we could find like a volunteer and actually show people how this process works. It might take more than one sitting, right? I'm up for that though, if you are.
Sure, we can talk about it.
Very cool. Well, listen, Todd, this is amazing. And this is something that I just think it's one of those positive goods, in my opinion, that if you can put this out into the world, just it seems like there could be so many things that could be solved. And, you just think of the needless suffering in the case of just the story you just told, right? Misdiagnosis, diagnosis bias, all of those kinds of things, they affect things far beyond these particular use cases that we're talking about, and they spill over into society. They spill over into, a lot of dysfunctional systems, dysfunctional relationships, and they don't have to be that way, which is one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated with this. So,
can I just jump in one more thing I want to say?
Sure.
Is that part of my motive for self-awareness is not just for people to improve their own state in life, but to have some degree of compassion or understanding of other people and their behavior, to treat themselves and then others better. While I'm not going to defend people who are abusive or, what are called sex offenders and so on, I will say that almost without exception, those people who break the law and should be punished according to our laws are suffering. And if you get past the judgment of those people are bad, and you just say these are people who are hurting, doesn't mean it excuses their behavior. It just means that if we just throw their ass in jail, okay, and we just punish them, kind of like prohibition, and we're not changing why they have this compulsion or why they engage in this behavior, why they have uncontrollable anger and they beat people or they gamble needlessly or whatever. If we don't change the pain inside, if we don't alleviate that, which then causes this transformation of how they live their life, then it's just really good for, it's good for the prison system, and it just complicates things. If we can actually look at these people with a little compassion and say, I don't like what you did. I mean, I don't judge people on what they did. They've already done it enough for themselves. But you could say, look, what you've done is illegal. What you've done is harmful, antisocial, dangerous, whatever. But let's change what's going on inside you so that you no longer need to act in that way. And once that happens, which is usually quickly, then they are reformed, which doesn't happen through conventional means. So I wish that we could, I learned that from dealing with that flasher, that he was you would pass him in the street and say, wow, that's a nicely dressed, albeit smoky smelling guy, but he looked like a normal guy. And yet he was, a criminal based on our laws. But I realized he was a decent guy who hated himself for what he did. And if we could look at people who we are quick to discard and try to be empathetic to helping them individually, then we could really make a big difference in the criminal system in this country.
Totally agree. We are aligned in many ways, and this thread goes through a lot of the things I think about and try to come up with systems for making things better, try to be more useful. Well, Todd, this has been great. We will compare notes about this other idea. I think it could be really cool. I'm already envisioning how we might do it, but we will be in touch about that. So until next time, thanks again. This has been great.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.